You worried?
Absolutely. What gets into the soil gets into groundwater. What gets into groundwater gets into the Columbia River, and we've got to do better than that.
It is a potential ticking time bomb for widespread environmental disaster, and it's right along the Columbia River. Tonight, KOIN 6 investigates the Hanford nuclear plant. It's the largest nuclear waste site in the country.
And we found out there are three main concerns with the waste left behind here. One, contamination has already reached groundwater and the Columbia River. Two, some of the storage tanks are now leaking. And three, a new plant that was supposed to prevent more leaks is now on hold. All this happening in Richland, Washington, right along the Columbia River, but before it flows downriver right through Oregon and Portland. And that's something we should all be aware of.
August 9th, 1945. An atomic bomb over Nagasaki, Japan, effectively ends the Second World War.
A great towering mushroom effect could be seen going higher and higher.
The plutonium in that bomb manufactured at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, 586 square miles in south central Washington state, owned by the federal government. Today, it's the most contaminated nuclear waste site in America and among the top 10 in the world.
Is the Department of Energy's status quo at Hanford acceptable to you?
No, sir, it is not.
U.S. Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz questioned just before his confirmation a year ago by Oregon Senator Ron Wyden. When it comes to Hanford, Wyden told me the Department of Energy is seeming to stick its head in the radioactive sand.
Most contaminated piece of federal property. It adjoins the lifeblood of our region, the Columbia River, and we've got to turn this around.
And if there's radiation that goes into the Columbia River, what does that mean?
Well, it means that it gets into the organisms like fish that we eat, and so it would essentially degrade the health of the river and be, at some level, a threat to human health.
Plutonium production ended here in 1987, so the federal government is trying to clean up the 56 million gallons of radioactive waste that still sits here at Hanford to keep it from seeping into the groundwater and eventually going into the Columbia River. But the failures associated with storing that waste and then trying to clean it up should give you chills. Here are the facts. The radioactive waste, including cancer-causing chromium, nitrites, and plutonium, are stored in 177 underground tanks, 149 single-shell tanks, and 28 with double shells for extra protection. The largest can hold up to 1 million gallons of radioactive sludge and liquids. I did some checking and found that 67 of the single-shell tanks are leaking or suspected of leaking. So the government has been pumping the deadly cocktail from the single tanks to the double tanks. Then something unexpected happened. KOIN 6 News obtained these images from the Department of Energy, showing that in October of 2012, a double-shell tank identified as AY102 was leaking as well. According to the Department of Energy, the outer shell is still holding, but the failure of a double-shell tank is a serious wake-up call.
I think most of us felt that those double-shell tanks were probably good for a long, long time, and the fact that one of them failed really caught our attention.
KOIN 6 News also obtained these documents, showing 6 other double-shell tanks may be leaking and 13 others possibly compromised. Washington Governor Jay Inslee estimates leaks from all tanks at 1,000 gallons a year.
So what you have is something akin to Groundhog Day, where the problems just repeat themselves again and again. And the problem, of course, is that this isn't exactly too funny.
What's being done to deal with leakage from the tanks, especially the double-shell tanks?
We have not found any of the other double-shell tanks to have a similar leak condition at this point in time. But we run a very active double-shell tank integrity program, which is a very comprehensive analysis to ensure that they are safe.
We wanted to know how the 56 million gallons of radioactive waste in the tanks will eventually be disposed of.
The plant includes 4 major nuclear facilities.
Under construction now, a $13 billion treatment facility called a vitrification plant,
Also known as the VIT plant.
The Energy Department says it will trap the waste into glass that can be safely stored. But in 2012, design flaws halted construction on one part of that plant. One whistleblower told CBS News the problems could have led to catastrophe.
If the explosion was severe enough, would be released to the public. It would be very similar to the explosions you saw at Fukushima.
Tomasitis was fired by URS, a major contractor on the project. So was safety manager Donna Bushy.
A clear and present message to the employees that if you speak up, if you stand up, you will be terminated.
URS told me Bushy was terminated for reasons other than her safety concerns. And they also disagree that there was any retaliation by URS against Dr. Tomasitis. Environmental groups, including Columbia Riverkeeper, tell me contamination has already hit the river at Hanford. The DOE says it's diluted to less than dangerous levels by the time it hits populations downriver. But groundwater measurements near Hanford's interior show radioactive contaminants more than 1,000 times federal drinking water standards. Fish spawn near Hanford and one of the world's largest salmon runs. I asked the Department of Energy about protecting the Columbia River at a recent public forum in Portland. How can you assure the people of the Northwest that dangerous levels of radioactivity will not get into the Columbia River?
We have a large removal operation along the Columbia River that's focused on the contaminated soil and solid radioactive waste that was buried next to the river, and we're nearing completion of removing all that contamination. We are also treating groundwater that is contaminated with radioactive contaminant.
Should we be worried?
Absolutely. What gets into the soil gets into groundwater. What gets into groundwater gets into the Columbia River, and we've got to do better than that.
Just last month, about 24 workers here at Hanford got sick from breathing dangerous chemicals. They were cleared to go back to work. They are among the nearly 8,500 employees who are working on the cleanup, which is slated to be done by the year 2047. It will cost upwards of $100 billion, and $40 billion has already been spent. Near Richland, Washington, Ken Boddie, KOIN 6 News.